we talked earlier about how when countries trade, that they're both better off, but that some people in those countries are not better off. And sometimes the people that are not better off are producers or suppliers of goods. So like if we start bringing Japanese steel to America, the jobs for producing steel are going to be lost and the producers will suffer. But sometimes the people who suffer are the consumers. For example, China produces the iPhone, and yet the iPhone is more expensive in China. Well, that's because of the way the comparative advantage works. So in our first graph, what we're going to have is a country that is exporting more of its good than importing. We begin this graph with a traditional supply and demand curve, and you will notice that there is a consumer surplus, which is represented by A and B, and there is a producer surplus, which is represented by the letter C. Now, when we enter the market globally, the producers from this country are going to be able to get a higher price because they're able to produce it cheaper. And so what we see is a new line that is the world price for their goods. And so the price is going to move to that world price. Well, what happens is that the price moves along the supply curve, the price moves along the demand curve, and we reach a new point, which is going to have, as a result, a new area we're going to call D. Because what's going to happen is the suppliers are going to start producing the quantity represented by point D, but the consumers are not going to be able to afford the higher price, most of them, and so they're going to be limited to just A. Whereas before they were A and B, now they're going to be just A. And what happens is the producers now pick up B, but they also pick up D because that's sales outside the country. And well, B and D are both outside the country, but the point is they're producing more revenue for themselves. So if we look at this then, we say before trade, this country's before exporting, this country had a joint utility and profit of A, B, and C combined. After trade, it's now A, B, C, and D combined. So the combination is now bigger and better for the exporting country. Now let's consider the importing country. So a country that imports more of the goods, before it starts importing, is going to look a lot like the exporting country. It's going to have a supply and demand curve. It's going to have a price, and we're going to have three components, A, B, and C. So the consumer surplus will be the area A, and the producer surplus will be the areas B and C. So now they decide we're going to respond to the world price. Well, what is the world price? Lower than our suppliers can produce. We can buy things cheaper on the open market, global market, than we can if we try to produce them ourselves. And so we'll draw that line there below the equilibrium point as the world price. So now what happens? Well, the price actually shifts out to this new point. And what that means is that the consumers are going to, in the country, are going to be able to buy those goods cheaper because they're importing goods that are a lot less expensive. And so what happens is the consumer surplus now is A, B, and D instead of just A. But what happened to the producer surplus? Well, the producer surplus used to be B and C, but B is now given back over to the consumers, and so the producers in the country are only able to generate C. However, if we add up pre and post, we see that in the pre situation, you had consumer surplus and profits were represented as A, B, and C. After the imports are opened up, the consumer surplus is now A, B, and D. And we combine the four together, and we see that we went from A, B, and C to A, B, C, and D. The country is better off. But you can also see that in one situation, the consumers are worse off And in another situation, the producers are worse off, even though the general benefit to the country was higher.